Good morning. I hope that you're all well. I think we have quite a few people on already, but in the interest of time, I'm going to get going so that you can, for those of you who are time boxed, we have plenty of time. Thank you for joining. I'm India Martin, for those of you who know me and those of you who don't. I spent some time over the last few weeks talking to folks about some of the challenges they're facing around the crisis. And so I decided to do this webinar, Leading Through Crisis, and a webinar that I'll do on Thursday called Effectively Leading Remote Teams to kind of support people through the challenges that they're now facing. This kind of working from home, remote management, leading through crisis thing happened very quickly. I know from January to now, things have changed in ways that none of us probably could have ever imagined. That's both from a kind of economic perspective, from a business perspective, just even running our day-to-day lives. And so this is my contribution to try to help folks kind of get their heads around it a bit. I will say that I'm giving you as much as I can in an hour. Again, I know folks are time boxed, as am I, but I wanted to give you as much as I could to help support. And you can always send me emails, ask questions later. I will have a Q&A at the end, which I'll talk about in a second. So you'll have a chance to answer ask some questions live as we go through this. So thank you for joining, and I'm going to move in. Okay, I'm waiting for my slides here. There we are. Okay, so I thought for those of you who don't know me, I'd give you a little bit of background around why I think at least I'm qualified to talk about this. My name is India Martin. I am a leadership expert. I'm executive coach and business advisor. In my last role, I was the global COO of Tech and Ops for a JP Morgan group, which was about 15,000 people in 54 countries. And one of the things that fell in my remit was business continuity planning and disaster recovery. So that's my kind of practical base. I was also a European CIO at Lehman Brothers, just up into 2008 until the crash. I'm on the current coaching faculty for Georgetown University's Executive Masters in Leadership program, and also on the coaching faculty of the New York City Bar Association's Associate Leadership Institute. And do a lot of offsite and retreat facilitation for boards and senior leadership teams. So that's kind of my professional background. My experience in this space, it's really interesting because as I thought back, I was in 9/11 and I was doing business continuity and disaster recovery in Europe at the time for Deutsche Bank. So that was my baptism by fire. I think the big first event that I experienced in my career, and I think a lot of folks experienced, which caused massive business disruption very quickly. Then 2003, I was living in Asia. I was in Tokyo, responsible for Asia Pacific during SARS. So again, my business continuity and disaster recovery training kicked in. I'll talk a little bit about what some of that was like. That's the most similar in terms of the kinds of public health crisis that we're facing at the moment. But I'll talk about that a bit. And then in 2008, I was at Lehman Brothers, working in the mortgage capital space, of all places, and then was also at Royal Bank of Scotland and ABN AMRO, where I left Lehman to join, which also had a very public crisis around bankruptcy and some other things. So I've had quite a bit of experience in terms of resilience, what it means to recover in these kinds of environments, et cetera. So I'll talk about that. And then my clients, the kind of folks that I typically deal with, are financial services, legal, consulting, government, and non-for-profit. I wanted to kind of lay that out so that you understood where my experience came from and what I was talking about. But before I go forward, I want to acknowledge a couple of people who have been really helpful and are supporting me through this. First, you'll probably see his name on the screen, Devin Martin, who is my husband, who is also a live events producer by trade. So he is producing this webinar and kind of managing this for me. So thank you for the technical Devin, who's here. The other person is Bill Billsborough, who I had the pleasure of working under at Lehman Brothers, who really kind of helped me think through some of the things I might want to cover and reminded me of around what kindness means in times like this as a leader going through crisis. So Bill, thank you for that. I know Bill's on too. So we will move on. So this is what I'm going to cover over the course of this webinar. So we're going to talk a little bit about the lay of the land, where we are and what's happening. Then people, process, stakeholder management. So when I talk about people in the first instance, I'm talking about people that you have in your respective worlds where you may have leadership responsibility over. Process is around kind of processes that you are invoking at the moment to kind of get through your day-to-day. Stakeholder management is everybody else. So your clients, your peers, other leaders, external bodies, whoever it may be, but stakeholder management is, we're going to talk about kind of how to manage those relationships through this crisis. And then one of my favorite things is opportunity and innovation. Out of crisis, and you will have heard this by now, I know folks are starting to talk about it, out of crisis comes great opportunity and often great innovation. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that because, whilst we're going through a significant amount of pain now, there's a silver lining. And we want to make sure that we think about what those things are too, and that we're not just focused so much on crisis that we lose the gifts that we get through the process. And then towards the end, for the last 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to try to get through as quickly as I can to give us some chance for question and dialogue. We'll do some Q&A. So that was the roadmap. We want to talk about the kind of strategies for managing people and process. And all of this is quite essential to effectively leading through conflict. So we're going to run into the first poll now. Our first poll is, what is your industry sector? So in a second, you'll see a poll pop up and it will ask you to identify your industry sector. It's coming. You should see it there. I'll give you about 15 seconds to do it. Financial services, law, consultancy, other corporate, education, government, not-for-profit, or medical. And we'll share the results with you in just a second. Okay, let's share the results. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is who's in the room. It's just useful for me to understand who's here so that I can, and so that I know when I'm kind of giving examples that I use things that are useful for you to see. So thank you for that. You can close the poll. Okay. So let's talk about where we are now and the crisis life cycle, what this looks like. So, people are really uncertain at the moment. There's a great sense of urgency. Everybody feels like everything is still quite critical. And so there are three kind of core parts, which you will hear about even in public health that we're talking about quite frequently, which is around the crisis of the life cycle. So before you get to crisis, you're doing planning, and that's kind of where business continuity and disaster recovery happens. I think one of the things most people, most organizations, and most businesses of any size will have business continuity and disaster recovery plans and do some kind of rehearsals for these kinds of events with some amount of regularity where there's strong governance around it. But I think that everybody will need to do this going forward if they don't already, even in your respective worlds, to ensure that everything that you're learning from this is covered and that you're thinking through what do we do if. The second part of the life cycle is containment. So that's kind of like preventive action, plan execution. So you have these plans, you're executing them, trying to contain whatever the issue is. And then finally, mitigation. That's the reactive action. So that is, we can't control this any longer. So now we have to mitigate whatever the outcomes might be. This is kind of your damage control space. I guess the question that you should be asking yourself is, where is your business and what parts are you on in this process? I think that most businesses are somewhere between containment and mitigation. Where folks plan to be able to work from home, where they had done some testing around that space, it was a lot easier, I think. And where there are already a lot of working from home agreements, I think it was easier for folks to be able to manage because there wasn't the setup required, the technical setup required. I think that a lot of IT groups around the world at the moment are really stressed and strained trying to ensure that folks in their respective spaces can log in and do the work that they need to do. So the question that I want you to ask yourself is, where is your business in this? And do you have a crisis-ready culture? What's really interesting is I was reading about Samsung who have what they call a crisis ready culture. And that is kind of always thinking about what the next thing might be. Now, a part of that for them is driving innovation, but it's also ensuring that they're always prepared for how they'll pivot in the event that something happens. And so the question is, again, where's your business? Do you have a crisis ready culture? And where are you between containment and mitigation? And if you're at containment, how do you continue to manage that without needing to move to a space where you're having to do damage control? So you can still do some planning if you're in the containment space to manage that. And one of the things I think is hugely important, and I will say it probably 10 times over the course of this webinar, is if you don't own your narrative, people will assume it. So making sure that you're communicating where you are, particularly to your teams as leaders, very consistently, I mean, like every day, is really important, because in a time of crisis particularly, I mean, I think any time, frankly, but particularly in a time of crisis, people need information. They want information. They're looking for information. And in absence of it, they will start creating information. So just ensuring that you're being really clear about where you are and what your business is doing along the curve every day to your teams is really, really important. So first, I'm going to kind of talk about you and who you are as a leader through this process. Because it's terribly important, but you understand how you're showing up at this point in time. So I have this, you'll see my favorite little pyramid here, and it has a number of different descriptors, I'll call them, around leadership in this kind of environment. And I think this is true, again, of leadership in general, but particularly in this environment. And I'll talk about some of those things. So the first thing is trust. Ensuring that you have the trust of your people when you're in crisis is critical, because if you don't, obviously getting them to respond and getting them on board and calming the waters when things are tough is incredibly difficult. So trust is number one. Credibility. Say what you do and do what you say. Do what you say you're going to do. It's really, really important, again, that you're credible, and that when you tell people you're going to do things, particularly in crisis, they know they can rely on that. People don't often have a lot of time to go back and do the checks. So that is as much for leaders as it is for folks who are, I'm saying for lack of a better term, being led. Making sure that you hold up to your end of the bargain, or saying that you can't, and communicating it even more vigilantly than you would under normal circumstances is important. Honesty and integrity, being honest about what you know and what you can tell. There's always the balance in challenging situations around what you tell people and what you don't from a business perspective. I've always erred on the side of being as honest and open as I can. I do understand that there are some things that you can't disclose for a variety of reasons, but actually, when you really get down to brass tacks, there aren't a lot of them. And so my thing is speak to people, tell them as much as you can, as often as you can, to begin to allay some of the concerns they may have. Decision making. So you have to be able to make decisions, and you have to be able to make decisions with the information that you have at the time. People will forgive a wrong decision, but they won't forgive indecision. So it's really important that you make the decisions that you need to make with the information that you have, and move on. And you can come back and shift things if you need to, but sitting on the fence, you cannot do during crisis, because again, folks are looking for some certainty. And what's within your control is what you can manage, and that is making decisions that you have with the information that you have. Communication, I've said this one already before. Communicate, over communicate. You can't tell people too much what's happening. Even if it's the same thing, they need to know that what is happening now remains. So communicate. And then lastly, and most importantly for me in the way that I operate, is service. And that's to remember that as leaders, you're actually serving other people. This isn't about you as a leader, you running things, you being in command or control of the situation. It's about how you're serving your teams to ensure that they can do their jobs, how you're serving your clients to ensure they get what they need, how you're in serving your suppliers, for example, people who are trying to supply to you during a crisis. So this is about how you serve as opposed to how you lead, in inverted commas. So think about how you can help people and how you can serve the people who are doing the work that you need delivered during this time. And there are two kind of key things on my axes, as you can see here. One is bravery. Bravery during times like this is required, and folks will look to you for it. So being sure-footed in your bravery is pretty key. And then the other one is allowing yourself to show vulnerability, because bravery doesn't mean that you don't feel. Bravery doesn't mean that you kind of march steadfast into something without having feelings about it. Allowing yourself to be vulnerable and allowing people to see that vulnerability lets them know that, yes, there's something about being approachable, one, but also that it's okay not to have all the answers. And so there are two kind of flip sides of this, which I think are important that you remember during crisis, because these are two things that happen quite frequently. One is intervention bias, and that's where there's overreach, where folks are kind of trying to do things that they really don't have the skill or capability to do. And so as leaders, it's our responsibility, where we don't have that skill and capability, though we think we might be great at leading, that we identify who those people are very quickly and get them engaged to do that, not overreach into doing things that we don't necessarily have the depth and ability to do, particularly from a technical perspective. The second bias is abdication bias, right? And that's kind of eschewing responsibility and placing blame on folks. In crisis, people are quick to blame. And so the reality is we don't have time to do that when we're trying to shore up organizations and shore up processes in crisis. And so being really aware of and ensuring that you're not seeing those kind of behaviors from yourself and from members of your team is really important. And I think a great quote that Brooke Foss-Westcott said, which is over kind of on the right-hand side of the screen, is great occasions do not make great heroes or cowards. They simply unveil them to our eyes. And that is the absolute truth. Who do you want to be? What do you want your legacy to be in terms of a type of leader that you were during this kind of crisis? Do you want people to remember that you were thoughtful, that you were sure-footed, that you made the best decisions that you could, that you were credible, and that you were trustworthy, or that you screamed and you shouted and you created a sense of urgency that folks found difficult to meet? So think about who you want to be. Think about how you show up, your tone of voice, the way that you walk, the way that you ask, the way that you think. Think about those things very carefully in terms of how you show up as leaders in a time such as this. And so kind of in closing out the who are you in this piece, I will remind you to get facts, get the facts of each situation before you make decisions as much as you can. Ask questions. If you're not listening, you're not getting good information. So if the communication is going one way and you're doing all the talking, similar to me right now, but I have to do that. If you're only speaking one way and you're not asking questions, you're not getting the full picture. So make sure that you listen and you're asking questions. And then plan. So through this process, we might be reactive at the moment, but we need to kind of carve out some space or some folks, which I'll talk about shortly, to plan and to kind of plan what's going to happen next so that you can communicate effectively with your teams. So I'm now going to go into the people quotient. So this is kind of about people leading your teams. And I think, it's really important to remember that actually there's a leader in every seat. And that you want folks out front thinking about how they can do things differently. And that you have to create the pipeline for people to be able to, for them to be able to have those conversations to bring their ideas forward. As I kind of mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about later, there's great innovation that comes out of crisis. So give people the space, other than obviously the things they need to do, to be able to contribute and help. So let's talk about people in this process. And I call this the emotion of it. And I love the Kubler-Ross change curve, which you'll see over on the right, and I'll talk a little bit about it. But there are kind of three parts of this when you think about the emotion of it and the culture that surrounds the emotion of it. One is the individual, and that's how I feel about it, and how I fit into this space and where I land and where I am at any given point in time. The divisional, so that may be your business unit or your division. So what's happening in our division? How are we operating as a whole? And they may not be aligned. Myself, the individual, may be in shock, and the division may be frustrated. So it just kind of depends. And then organizational. So our whole business, where are we on the curve? And you really need to kind of think about all of those things. And they are different and can be different at any given point in time. And, if you remember that crisis heightens emotions. We're all different people and we all respond differently to crisis situations. And so you can expect that individuals on your teams will be at different places on the curve at different times, which obviously presents, a bit of a management challenge because you're having to manage different folks to get them to different spaces. But I will say this, when folks are at shock, denial, or frustration, and then depression, you'll start to see the trudge where people are moving a little bit more slowly, or folks aren't quite sure what to do, which is where your leadership needs to come in. That this is the shock, denial, frustration, depression spaces are where leaders have to come in and help motivate their teams and help them move along the curve. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's the kind of external environmental factors. So the environmental factors are the things that are external that you can't control. There are things that you can control internally, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. I have them written here so that I don't forget any of them. But there are the environmental factors that you can't control in addition to all the things that you can in your day-to-day work. So let me talk about the curve a little bit and the pieces of the curve. I'm going to talk about the psychological factors, which you'll see below. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that all risks are not created equal and are not accepted equally, and talk a little bit about what those are. So we start at shock. So when crisis happens, people are in shock. They don't know quite what to do. I know that, for example, 2 or 3 weeks ago for me, like one of my weeks was almost an entire write-off, because as I started thinking about the fact that my husband and son were still living in the UK and are commuting back and forwards to the US and haven't moved here yet. And when I'm thinking about the fact that I have 2 daughters who are here, who are in school, and I'm thinking about the fact that I have clients who have needs that I'll have to fulfill, I was actually a little bit in shock about how I was going to do all this and kind of dealing with my own emotions around what was going to happen next. And then there's denial, right? So you move into denial where you just kind of act like nothing's happening. We're going to get on with it. Nothing's happening. Let's just kind of move through it. To frustration. Why is this happening? And how am I going to deal with this? And what are we going to do next? Down to depression, and depression not in the traditional sense of the word, but the organization, person, or division are feeling the pain of all of the change and the change happening so quickly. But then on the other side, you start to come out and you start to think about experimenting. So where are the opportunities here? How might we operate differently or better? And then there's the decision. Actually, we are going to do this. It's going to get better. And these are the things that we're going to do. To integration, which is really around starting to integrate your new behaviors and kind of bringing yourself out of the other side. And then things starting to return to the new normal, because we know, kind of as we're seeing, there's likely not going to be a normal that as we've known it again. So how do we now start to operate in the new normal? So here's some of the psychological factors that are happening to people, why all of these things are happening along the curve. The first one is vicarious rehearsal, right? And that's about risk. And I always find this one interesting. So it's kind of like, you're more likely to get hit on the head. You're more likely to die by getting hit on the head with a coconut than you are getting eaten by a shark, for example. And both of them may seem far-fetched, but people can have very rational fears in their minds around the likelihood of one of those two things happening. And so it's really about vicarious rehearsal is about experiencing things that are really unlikely to happen to you. And you'll find a lot of that happening during the kind of frustration and depression parts of the curve. And then denial, kind of as we talked about already. So denial is denial. I'm not going to go over that one again. Then stigmatization. Gosh, these words. Stigmatization. Let's do it with syllables now. And that's when you start to have stigma around the things that are happening, and you're starting to respond to stigma. Fear and avoidance, again, all of these things are kind of happening around the frustration and depression space. And then withdrawal, hopelessness, and helplessness. So, you may see staff or people that start to withdraw and you're having a harder time pulling them in. It's a part of the change process in the emotional curve. And so, the best thing you can do when you see that happening is not try to kind of like push people into submission. It's really about how you support them through that. And it may be by stepping back and getting other folks to kind of step in who are further along the curve. So you folks have to go through these various pieces. And your job as a leader is to support them through it and figure out where they are and how you might be able to help. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, which I don't have on the slide, but it's related. And that's kind of risks and how all risks are not accepted equally by people. So here are kind of some of the examples. Voluntary versus involuntary. So things that, happen, there are risks that you decide to take versus those that happen. Controlled personally versus controlled by others. So things that you control versus the things that other people control. And so when you're thinking about your teams, one of the things that you want to continue to remind them of is managing the things they can control. And there are things outside of your control which you cannot manage and will not be able to manage, but manage the things that you can. And that goes for you in terms of the container and support you can provide for your teams as well. Natural versus man-made kinds of things, reversible versus permanent, statistical versus anecdotal, and fairly versus unfairly distributed in terms of how things happen and where they happen. So just kind of remember that as you're going through this change and as these crises is occurring, people are going through a range of emotions. And by the by, as professionals, people will step up as much as they can. But I just say, kind of think about how these things are impacting people and where they are emotionally, and how that shows up in the work that they do. So we have a poll coming. Where do you think most of your team are on the curve? Now, the poll will pop up in a second. That's poll 1. We need to get to poll 2. Just a second. We're going to drop to poll sector 2. There we go. Where do you think most of your team are? So and this is general, okay? So you can't talk about everybody, but generally, shock, denial, frustration, depression, experimentation, decision, integration, or you just don't know. You haven't had enough time to kind of think it through, but you just don't know. Take a minute to go through this. A few people still voting. Okay, so let me show you the results. So it looks like most folks feel like they've come out of the kind of depression space, or they're kind of moving into experimentation at 30%. The second is frustration. I think that in my experience anyway, you can leave the poll for a second. In my experience anyway, I think folks are really kind of in frustration and depression. I think that people are kind of on autopilot, which is different than being prepared to move forward and into experimentation. I think folks are on autopilot. They're trying to adjust to kids being at home if they have them, or managing and supporting elders who may or may not be in their homes, and a whole bunch of other external factors other than just the work. But this is really interesting in terms of where people feel you are. And I think it's a useful mechanism to understand that, and I think this is a really good testimony that people are in very different places. And this may be representative of what your organization looks like and the people who are within it at any given point in time. Okay, you can stop sharing. We'll move. Okay, so I'm going to move to selecting the right team to lead through crisis. So Bill Billsborough, I know you're out there somewhere. This is one that you reminded me of, that you always talked about. And this is about really selecting the right team at all. Like, this is something that Bill used to always encourage us to apply as we were kind of building our teams. But actually in crisis, this is even more important. The first thing is attitude. So when you're thinking about the folks who are leading you through crisis, and it may not be your operating committee or your executive team, you want to think about the right folks with the right skills to get you through a time. And so attitude, and that's whole person attitude. How does this person show up? What's their demeanor, tone of voice, behavior? How willing are they to do what needs to be done with the kind of attitude that you would hope the rest of your team would demonstrate? The second thing is aptitude, kind of natural ability. There are folks who have really good instincts around what to do when things go awry. And so how are this person's instincts, even if they don't have the answers? So natural ability doesn't mean that you have the answers to everything. It means that you have the instincts around thinking through or being thought leaders around how you may do some of the work that needs to happen. And not having the answers is really, really important in all of this. We will not have the answers all the time. We will not have the answers most of the time. So just kind of having the right attitude and having the right aptitude is helpful when you're thinking about the kind of folks you want in the room. And then lastly is ability. And that's the kind of more learned ability. How much experience does this person have? What do they know that could be useful to us through this crisis? So kind of when you're thinking about the people that you want to engage, a lot of you will already have done this and be engaging, but I will ask you to kind of think through the folks in that group and ask yourself if they have the right attitude, aptitude, and ability. So now I want to talk a little bit about process. I know we're about half an hour in. I'm going to go for about 15 to 20 more minutes tops so that we can get into some questions. But here are kind of 7 steps to lead through crisis. One is about being careful with risk comparisons. And what does that mean? That means making comparisons around this risk being less than or more than that risk, because the reality is we don't know. So, a natural human instinct will be like, yeah, this is bad, but it's not as bad as when, or like, someone saying, this isn't as bad, this is bad, but not necessarily as bad as 9/11. That's subjective. And making those kind of risk comparisons doesn't give people comfort through crisis, because everybody, again, remember those kind of, risks, and I talk about them not being accepted equally, which were things like voluntary versus involuntary, whatever it may be. Everyone has their own view of what that feels like. And so making risk comparisons is your view, but may not suit everyone else's. So being really careful about not making comparisons about how good or bad the situation is. The second thing is not to over reassure people. So yes, you can be steadfast in your messaging and ensure that you're getting it out there, but don't over reassure people, because the reality is we don't know what this is going to look like and how it's going to turn out. If you look at some of the other countries who are going through and have gone through this crisis, we have not peaked yet in terms of illness, right? And people catching this virus. And so you can't over reassure people about how it's going to turn out, because we don't have enough information to be able to do that. What you can assure them about are the things that are, again, within your control. So the things that you all are doing together day to day, you can absolutely assure them about, but you can't over assure people about things over which we have no control. The next one is sensitive syntax, and that's kind of how you say things to people. It's really important that you choose your language carefully and that you think through what you're saying and how you're going to say it. Even though, it's a really challenging time, especially for senior leaders who have a lot of the weight of carrying organizations, the weight of their own self-care, which I will certainly talk about, and the weight of just trying to do delivery and to clients and to everybody else during this time. It's really easy for us not to be sensitive about how we say things because we just want to get it done. But the reality is, again, if you go back and think through that emotion curve and the crisis curve, if you don't treat people in a way that's supportive during this time, the output that you get on the other side isn't going to be what you expect either. So just kind of thinking about how you say things. Acknowledging uncertainty. It is okay to say we do not know at this time, or actually not even we. I do not know at this time how this will end. But what I can tell you is insert here the things that you can control, and consistently do that. And I know it feels like I'm going over and over that, but I can't stress enough how important it is to be honest about what you don't know, and be honest about what you do. You can be rest assured that given the economics of this, people are going to say, are our jobs at stake? Are we going to lose our jobs? That's going to be the first thing they ask. And so that's one of the things you want to practice answering. You might not know the answer to that yet, but is it a possibility? Absolutely. I don't think there's going to be a business that isn't going to be touched through this crisis. And so being honest with people about what that looks like is really important, because they know that it's potentially coming. So if you act like it's not, that's where you start to lose credibility, and there starts to be a crisis in confidence around leadership and what they will actually tell and not tell. You don't have to talk about, excuse me, you don't have to talk about the underlying economics of the business. I mean, folks can see that in public companies. I'm not asking you to disclose things that put your business at risk, but I am saying that people are going to ask questions about very difficult things. And you as leaders have to be prepared to have those conversations. The next thing is give people things to do. I mean, obviously they have work to do, but start thinking about how people can mobilize your business. I mean, remote working is challenging as it is. And so think about giving people things to do that they may be able to help with through the crisis so that you keep them engaged. And the more folks are able to be engaged and support you, the better off you are in terms of having ambassadors who can go out and continue to kind of spread the messaging, but also ensuring that people feel like they are part of the solution and it's not just happening to them. Next is stop trying to allay panic. Like, you can't allay people's fears during times like this in a way that you can control it, right? So you can make them feel more comfortable, but the reality is we know there's going to be discomfort through the entirety of this time. And so don't spend a lot of your time trying to allay panic and fear. Spend more of your time trying to ensure that you have a sustainable operating model that people can point to in terms of how they should behave and what they should do. That's all you can provide. You can provide the framework and the container, but you can't allay their panic. That's not something that's within your control, though you can create the conditions for them to be more comfortable. And then I think lastly is acknowledge people's fears. People are scared. And I mean, I'm scared. And I think a lot of people are scared. We're all thinking about, I think about my parents who are in another city, my grandmother who's 99 years old in another city, my son who's in the UK, my husband who happened to make it here. But my husband who, is here, there are people that have distributed families and loved ones all around the globe who they can't get to right now. And it's scary for people. And so, when I'm going to say this on a later slide, but grant people grace. And remember that all that's happening for them, actually, there may be more external happening for them than what's happening at work. It does not mean work stops. Business has to continue to keep our economy going. But acknowledge people's fears and spend some time with them to understand what they may be experiencing. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. So now I have a poll. This is poll number 3. Do you think the leaders in your organization have the skills to lead through crisis based upon some of what I just talked about? Do you think they are doing that well in your space? Yes, no, somewhat, maybe. I have complete confidence, and I think they're woefully underprepared, which I think is okay too. Let's let this go for a minute. Looks like we're still going. Still have a few voting. Let's let you guys carry on voting. Give you 5 more seconds and we'll show the results. Okay, let's wait. Okay, sorry if you didn't get a chance there. We're sharing the results. We have 50 people who voted. So it looks like a lot of you, it looks like about 32, it looks like 50% of you feel like you have complete confidence or yes, which is nice to know. I mean, that's about half. And then there are more of you, almost half who feel like 12% feel like they're woefully underprepared, maybe, and no. So it's really interesting. And I think that the one thing, it depends on the size and maturity of your organization in a lot of spaces. It depends on whether folks have been through things like this before or been through crisis before. So I will say that that even with other leaders that you may work with and or your own even, to give people grace and know that, again, folks are doing the best they can, but hopefully some of what we're talking about here, you can take back into your spaces and start to demonstrate and start to share to get folks thinking about how they might do things differently as the crisis continues. I'm gonna come out of here. So let's talk a little bit about other stakeholders. So that's kind of managing your clients, your peers, your leaders, people that may be like you, if you're senior leaders, maybe your board or other folks, shareholders, suppliers. So stakeholders are people in organizations whose attitudes and actions have an impact on your success. So there are all those different people who if they're engaged, can be great, but if they're not, they can cause some significant disruption if you're not kind of managing them as a part of this process. It's not just about your own teams. It's also about the people around you. And again, managing your messaging. So effective communication during crisis ensures that those people, those stakeholders, receive information that's relevant to their needs and enables you to manage the narrative. And again, I said it before and we'll say it again and again and again. If you don't manage your narrative, other people will. And so kind of how can I do this and what does this look like through this crisis? One, understand their needs as if they were your own. So really understand what's driving this particular person from this particular group. What is it? What are their needs and how can you help to support those needs? You can't be everything to everybody and you can't solve everything, but you can help and you can support. So understand their needs as if they were your own. To each of these groups, communicate often. As a leader during crisis times, 80% of your job should be communicating to people. 80%. 20% should be kind of planning and strategy, like what are we going to say? And 80% you should be out there doing it. There will be people who can do the work behind the scenes to get you ready for the communication, but your job during crisis is communicating. Particularly now where we're having to do everything remotely, people will see you less. So you have to create the opportunities for folks to see you. So it might be a daily messaging that you're doing out to the whole of your business. It might be, the one-to-ones you're doing. People need to see you. So make sure that when you're do less calls and do more video, right? Calls are great, but video is better. And again, people are isolated. They're in their own spaces. They need to see you. Communicate often with your stakeholders. Anticipate. So when you're thinking about your people and your teams, anticipate what do these stakeholders need? And then think about how you can provide some of that. Again, that is about controlling and managing your narrative as well. Don't be a voyeur, help. So don't just watch what's happening to people and watch what's happening to your stakeholders. It's interesting to understand their needs, but do something about them. Don't just watch, help. Monitor changing needs. Things will change for people, for each of these groups as you go through the process. So how do you monitor those changing needs? And then how do you respond to them? And then the other thing is understanding your stakeholder interdependence. So pretty much, when you look at your whole kind of stakeholder wheel, there will be interdependence between those groups and the kinds of things they need and expect. Understand what that is and understand how your communication impacts that interdependence. And so my quote for this one is, be quick with the facts and slow with the blame. So facts, make sure that you're digging into what the root of some of the issues are that people are facing. I think this is an important one, which is adapted from some other work that I was doing, but I just wanted to put it out there because, during crisis, there are a lot of courageous conversations you need to have here. It's something going on with these words. There are a number of courageous conversations that you'll need to have. Particularly, again, around some of the things that are already beginning to happen around reductions in people and projects and any number of things. So when you need to have these conversations, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things. Stay engaged and be present. So stay engaged in the conversations, and even though they're going to be some of them will be terribly uncomfortable, the courageous conversation is the one you don't want to have, but you have to. So stay engaged and be present. Speak your truth. Speak what you know to be true as far as you know it, and understand that your truth may not be the truth. It is your truth. Experience discomfort. Know that you will experience discomfort as you're having conversations that are difficult. So allow yourself to experience that discomfort and understand that it's a normal part of the process, the emotional process you go through as you're going through crisis and difficult conversations. Grant amnesty and honor confidentiality. So I talk about granting people grace all the time. Give them some grace for some of the things that are happening, but grant people amnesty and grace and honor their confidentiality. So people will tell you things that will be really confidential during times like this. So make sure that you're honoring that confidentiality, except where you need to share it with, like, I don't know, a human resources professional or something in terms of support. And then I think the last one, which is huge, is expect and accept non-closure. Everything isn't going to be tied up in a nice little neat tidy box that you can just put away when the conversation's over. Expect and accept that there will not always be closure at the end of these challenging conversations, and particularly in a time of crisis. So I'm at 11:44. I'm going to try to get through these next couple of slides in about 5 minutes. And I'm getting there now anyway. This is kind of coming to the end. And these are the what should I do, the core strategies. So command and control is not the answer right now. I say that, I know that you need to have control over what's happening in your spaces, but command and control in terms of how you're treating your teams is not. And let me tell you why. If you are commanding and controlling and you're telling people exactly what they need to do, they will do exactly what you tell them to do, as opposed to doing some of the other things that might need to be done that you're assuming that they would just do. So make sure that you're not operating in a command and control style where folks don't feel like they have the leeway to do anything else. Again, you're quashing innovation, you're quashing people's ability to be able to contribute when you're being completely command and control and you're not listening and asking. So communication, I'm going to go through these quickly. Communicate frequently and identify a comms team. And your comms team may not just be the comms team that you have in regular times. It may be folks who have their ear to the ground of the organization, who you know are great ambassadors. So think about your comms team as being the kind of ambassadors around this crisis, folks that you know can get the word out, folks that you know have great opinions and great ideas around what might happen. People won't see you, so create those opportunities, which I mentioned. Continue to gather information. It's a great time, especially in these kinds of environments, to do polls and surveys with your teams. So how are people getting on at home? Are people concerned about what are the concerns people have? Getting those kind of polls out there, collecting that data and responding to it is a wonderful part of having a good comm strategy in a crisis and at times when people are distributed. Share other news too. So for example, is your organization continuing with its CSR strategy, for example, your corporate social responsibility? Are you still doing that? Are you still supporting charities? What are the things that your organization is doing which are really good? But keeping in mind that while you're talking about supporting external folks, you need to make sure that you're talking about how you're supporting the internal ones too. And create a comms pipeline, two-way, where people can give you their feedback and you can get theirs. One of the things that I did during SARS in 2003 was I did a concerns register. So I had a spreadsheet where folks could go and log their personal concerns. And they didn't share it, but they could go and log their personal concerns. And so I knew what was happening with people individually, because they were like, listen, my daughter's really sick now, or, I have a relative has contracted SARS, or this, or whatever it might have been. But I had it and I could start to respond to people in a very human way. And you can't do that for everybody, but if you have your leaders do it for their teams and so on and so forth, you start to create an environment where folks really start to understand how people in the organization are being impacted by the external factors that are occurring. And then just tailoring your communications appropriately for stakeholders, understanding what people need, as I talked about before. Solutions. So I think, one of the important things to do is have a solutions team in addition to your comms team. These are the kind of folks who could identify what can and can't be done remotely. We think we know, but what makes sense to do remotely and what makes sense not to do anymore remotely? Let's not waste people's time trying to have them do everything they were doing in the office when some of those things may not be necessary. So what are those things and what does it look like? Let this team be the crisis team. Don't make your entire organization have to deal with crisis all the time. Let the crisis stuff sit with this team so that you can contain it from the rest of the organization and allow them to do some business as usual and other work as they normally would do. You want to create some normalcy. And while there are some people who will be kind of managing through the crisis, they are the kind of supporting function. You want other people to kind of feel comfortable and be able to start doing some of the work. Define the role and purpose for each member in this group. And the team may change over time to include additional expertise. Manage employee engagement with laser focus. So a part of this whole solutions thing is ensuring that you are engaging with your employees all the time and that this team is there to support the needs that they may have. Empathy, one of my biggest things. I always talk about it. People get tired of hearing me talk about it, but remember what others are feeling during this time. Take a minute to acknowledge the challenges they're facing. Grant them grace for the 75th time today. Caring and kindness should be the default in terms of how you show up as a leader. And stakeholders, and that's all of them, will remember how you made them feel, because this time will pass, and how you come out the other side is how you led at a time when people really needed your leadership. And then lead, be poised and positive, monitor your cadence, the way you speak, the way you move, the way you behave. Know the difference between managing and leading, right? So the manager is sailing the boat and the leader is charting the course. Your job as leaders at the moment is about charting the course for people. Respect governance. So there are rules, and rules are in place for a reason, but adjust it as required. And sometimes during these times, it may need to be on the fly, and give yourself a little bit of space to do that if you need to. And acknowledge and encourage leadership in every seat. Acknowledge that folks have capabilities and skills that they can bring to the table to help the organization through this time. And then 3 words I have at the bottom: scrutiny, reputation, and viability. So the scrutiny is on leadership in times like this. And so folks are watching. Your reputation is at risk, and your viability as a leader on the other side is in question, whether good or bad, as you go through this. This is my last little piece, and I'm going to go to questions. I will stay on for a little bit longer for people who need to. I know some have hard noon stops, and I will try to take some of those questions, but I do want to talk about innovation before we move into questions. So what's the opportunity for innovation? Incremental innovation, yes. Radical innovation, absolutely. But really the aha innovation is what you're looking for. What are the aha moments that you're having out of this crisis, and how do you capitalize on those? So first, you want to identify, what does the market need? So while all this is happening and you're looking around at your stakeholders, what does your market need? What does your business need? And what do your stakeholders need? So do your identification of kind of what folks need and where the opportunities are. The second thing to do is test it. So what you come up with, does it satiate the need of those stakeholders, of your business, of the market? Is it efficient? Because it's nice for it to be something that's innovation, but if it's not efficient, is it sustainable? And the answer to that is probably no. And then how will it change the future? So whatever you come up with, whatever your innovation is, how will it change the future of your organization, of your stakeholders, of the market? And then lastly, let's just go out and innovate. Like, plan it, do it, and reinvent. You're going to always need to be going around the wheel of reinvention as this happens. 2-second little thing I'll share is that, like Nokia, the telephone supplier, apparently they first did boots, and then they did like kitchen appliances or something, then televisions, and then mobile phones. And they always kept kind of reinventing themselves based upon what the market needed. So we can't do that, obviously, in everything that we do, but I just want you to think about how you become something different if you need to, from a process perspective, from a product perspective, and also the social innovation. So process innovation is one thing, and that's, for folks who are in the kind of consulting services, law, government, process innovation is right for you at this time. Product innovation for folks who may be in technology and financial services or whatever it might be, there'll be some great product innovation that you can come up with. And then social innovation is something for all of us. So how do we change the world? How do we demonstrate purpose-driven leadership at a time when it's very clearly needed across the world? And how do we show up in doing that? So last poll, and then we're going to move to Q&A, is, are there opportunities that you can think of for innovation in your business? So yes, lots. There may be some. No, not that I know of, or I'm just not sure, and I don't know. Let's see where you guys are with this. Give you a few more seconds to get it. We're still moving. Okay. We're going to share the results. So this is really encouraging. because it looks like, most people think, yeah, there's lots of room for innovation in our business. And that is such a wonderful thing. So when you're thinking about what innovation might look like, when I talked about earlier, getting people to do something, what a wonderful thing to get people engaged and to get their minds off of some of the challenges that you're facing. When you think about your teams, like, hey, what is some of the innovation? What are some of the things we're learning? What can we do differently? It is a huge opportunity to re-engineer process and to kind of reshape your business, and to ensure that when crises like this happen in the future, you're more nimble, and that there will always be things that you can create. So I'm going to stop sharing this particular poll. I'm going to move to questions. I hope that there are some. I think there are going to be plenty. I know that we ran a little bit over. I'm going to look at my questions here. Sorry, can you try that for me to see? Thanks. Let me go to my Q&A here. So, okay, first question. Interesting. Actually, a couple of questions. Will you be sharing slides at the end? Thanks. Is it possible to get slides? Unfortunately, these slides are a part of my business. They are part of what I do day to day. So I won't necessarily be sharing the slides, but I will be sending a one-pager out to anybody who's registered with the kind of tips and tricks and things that I've talked about. So sorry, I won't distribute all the slides, but I certainly will be distributing the one-pager, which you can use as a reference. There's a question here, the emotion curve. Doesn't it also depend on where you are in the course of the virus itself? Yes, it does. And that's a good question. And one that let me think about this. So yes. And as things, I kind of talked about us not having hit the peak of the virus yet, and people may go back up or down depending on kind of what happens and the emotional impact each time there's an event. So that crisis curve is a wave 1 crisis curve. It will change again for wave 2. People may, as things get really bad, go back to being in shock or being in denial, or go back up and down the curve as it may. Question. People I lead may be worried to ask me questions or share thoughts, as they may think I am too busy managing the crisis. How can we encourage idea sharing or questions in that context as we all work from home? So that's a great question, but it's also about you creating the space for people to feel like they can. So telling people that they can, and like doing those, I kind of talked about making sure that you are speaking to your teams all the time, and that you're talking to them daily, and that you're saying, listen, I need your help. I need your questions. I need to make sure that as we think about how we move forward, I'm getting all of your input. I talked a bit about doing some of the surveys and some of the polls and getting them out to your teams. Those are great ways of kind of starting the conversations. And I would also say that when you're doing surveys and polls, ask people where they're comfortable to give you their names, so that you can go and follow up and ask people questions and come back and start the dialogue. Okay. So the next question is, how can we support people better as an organization's psychological safety? I think psychological safety is really, really challenging. And I think that a lot of folks don't necessarily feel safe. I mean, they feel safe in their own homes, but there are a lot of challenges. I think I'm answering your question, that people face. And so psychologically, when I kind of talked about supporting people through emotions, that's the only thing you can do, is understand that people feel exposed, they feel vulnerable, and that as organizations and as their kind of main source of income, and actually for a lot of people, the place where they spend most of their time, us creating the stability that we can, that I mentioned is within our control, is one of the keys to providing the kind of psychological safety that people will be feeling is missing through the crisis. Should we also be communicating up the chain of leadership, and how often? How do we remain relevant in light of all the decisions our leaders are currently making day to day? That is wonderful. That's a really, really great question. You absolutely should be going up the chain of leadership. People will tell you if they don't want your information, or if they don't want to hear what you have to say. And so I think it's really important in terms of relevance. Relevance is about that leading from the seat that you're in space. So if you're doing the kinds of things that I talked about with your teams, And if you are taking the time to share some of this stuff with other folks around how you're managing through the crisis, relevant is about how you show up. And so I wouldn't worry so much about trying to be relevant by talking up the chain. I try to be more relevant about how you lead in the space that you're in, because again, as this crisis moves on and as we kind of move to the other side, folks will remember who the real leaders were, and you can show up in that way. Co-opetition. So that's partnering with competitors towards a common goal. Can you talk about leveraging competitors as stakeholders? These could be intra-organizational or industry peers. That is a wonderful question, and absolutely. You want to, at times like this, there's kind of, I call them utility functions, the kind of things that we all have concerns about, that we can talk about and figure out the best way of doing without necessarily needing to share our trade secrets. And so, yes, absolutely. I think I just saw in the UK that the supermarkets were kind of, well, the government kind of helped to do this, but the supermarkets were disbanding their competition laws so that the supermarkets could band together and leverage staff and food and all other kind of things, which is really, really useful. So at times like this, absolutely. And again, what you'll tend to find, I think, over time is that that competition and that cooperation, well, the co-opetition, as you called it, ends up creating, again, better utility functions that everybody can use. And then you have more of a space to go off and kind of do your individual thing because the baseline utilities have been defined that everybody's using. So it's kind of the creating utility spaces. My space is more of serving the community and being innovative and raising funds. How can I use this pandemic once it's over to fuel future giving? That's a good question. And it's really challenging for fundraisers at the moment because there are so many organizations that require support. And more than that, every person has their own, the thing they bleed for. That's what I call it. So my heart bleeds for children and education. And so my focus is on those things. I mean, I think other people will bleed for something else. Hearts will bleed for something else. So I think one of the challenges around fundraising is that you have to understand where people are and what's really important to them. But on the other side of this, I think that we're already starting to see humanitarian efforts and folks coming out and doing wonderful things. I will say this, it is very natural as things will get more difficult, that people will not necessarily be so pleasant for some period of time. So while right now folks are all wearing this together, human nature shows something different when things get really, really hard, and it may in fact happen. So I think, but what you will see on the flip side of that is that at the end of it, folks really understand that we really need each other to survive, and that a lot of the things that we're trying to raise funds for are kind of basic human need. And I'm hoping that there are some major shifts as a result of that. How do you best communicate bad news? Honestly, I mean, that's all you can do. And I think saying that I'm not always going to have good news. And if you're saying that to people regularly, I will tell you everything I know. It's not always going to be good news, but I will be honest when I tell you and share it with you, then folks can take it. So I think don't underestimate people's ability to take news as long as you're being honest and as long as you're being consistent. What was the journal idea you mentioned that you did during SARS? Okay, yep, I'll repeat that. So during SARS, one of the things I did, I created a spreadsheet that I sent out to my whole team and individually, so it was their spreadsheets. So I had 8 people on my leadership team at the time in different countries around Asia. I was sitting in Tokyo, then I had Hong Kong and Singapore and India, a number of different countries. And there were 8 people. And I sent them each a spreadsheet. And on the spreadsheet, I asked them to list their personal concerns. So it could be around business, it could be around home, it could be around whatever it was. And what that enabled me to do is really understand what people were going through because I asked. People won't tell you unless you ask, especially if they think you're busy. And so I asked them to give me their information, and then I couldn't deal with every single thing that everybody had. But where I saw things that were within my control that I could manage or support, I acted on them or had somebody in my team act on them. So it just lets people know that you hear them, that you're listening. I use that concern register in every single one of my one-to-ones with them. So when I had a one-to-one, I'd pull up that person's concern register and I'd say, okay, so tell me what's happening. Let's talk about it before I even got into business. So folks knew that I was concerned about how they were and how they were able to operate before we stepped into our kind of day-to-day business, especially during crisis. Innovation during uncertainty. How can we balance speed with accuracy, and when and how to pivot when ideas don't work? That is the million-dollar question, especially the pivot one when ideas don't work. As an entrepreneur now, and one that's been an entrepreneur since 2013, I can't always say I pivoted quickly enough, and I'll answer your first question second. But what I will say is that you don't know until you try it, and it does take some bravery, and you do have to insulate yourself against going too far. And I say the checks and balances are other people who are around you who may see things happening, and you're never in this by yourself, right? So when you're doing innovation, you're never in innovation and ideas by yourself. So it's really about what the team collectively believe is the right thing to do. Do we think that we should carry on with this, or do we think option B is better? So I say lean on the folks around you when you're making those kind of decisions instead of making them in isolation, so that, again, whatever decision you make is the best decision because you made it as a group and you took diverse ideas into place. And how can we balance speed with accuracy? Again, that's a million-dollar question, but I always say testing. You have to test. It's great to have an idea. It's great to want to put it into production, but you have to test. And there's no short answer for testing in some cases. And so the innovation doesn't necessarily have to happen today. The innovation may be something that was born out of this, but that happens 24 months from now. But if you don't do the testing to make sure that you worked out the kinks, you can do more damage in innovation than good. I have a couple more questions I'm going to take. I know we're at 12:05. I'll go to 12:10. I know I ran a little bit over, and I'll try to answer as much as I can. There are quite a lot of questions here. How do you ensure your own emotions don't affect your way to lead when you might be going through depression in the emotions curve? That is absolutely the case. And we all feel it. And the reality is, you can demonstrate your vulnerability. You can say, this is really hard for me too. But as a leader, it's your responsibility to lead other people through it, right? And that doesn't mean that you forget yourself, because as leaders, one of the things, particularly in crisis, that we have to be laser focused on is self-care and ensuring that we're taking care of ourselves and that we're fueling ourselves, that we're eating well, that we're sleeping well. And we're not always sleeping well during crisis, but that we're doing as much as we can around taking care of ourselves, because you can't lead others if you can't take care of yourself. So that's really, really important. But I'd say that the vulnerability piece is important because people need to know that you're human too. So it's okay to be deep in the curve and feel like I don't know how I'm going to come out of this myself. But what you should be focused on as leader is how you're going to bring your business and your team through it. I mean, I know that that's a challenging thing to do, and that leaders are human too. But the reality is that that's why we're put in the seats that we're put in. It's to be able to access those leadership skills when things get tough. You really find out who leaders are when things are hard, right? It's easy, not easy, but it's easier when everything's status quo, when you can kind of plan, when you can decide, when you have your budgets, you can do whatever you need to do. But real leadership is demonstrated when there's crisis, when there is no script, when you have to show up because that's who you are. And it's kind of that attitude, aptitude, and ability thing that you look for and that you have to pull on as a leader when things are going as they are. In an ever-changing internal business environment, an acquisition of our company was recently announced. Greatly impacted by COVID-19 on a global basis, how do you recommend we manage the many streams of change at once? Oh, that's a big one. There are a couple of organizations that I work with who are going through some significant change around acquisition and integration right now. And that is a really, really hard one, frankly. And all of this is hard, to be honest. And I don't want to make it sound easy because it's not. the questions, and I'm sure they're being raised, are how much and what do you do until things stabilize? What is the greater issue that needs to be resolved right now? And I would say that the greater issue today is ensuring business stability at all, and that your people are able to do the work they need to do to get you through an acquisition and integration. Because actually, if you don't do that, the rest of it kind of falls apart. You need folks to be in place, and you need them to be able to do the work they need to do. And so, there is a prioritization around what's important. And I think, I'm sure those conversations are happening. I know that in one of the organizations I work with, those conversations are absolutely happening. How do we stabilize first? And as leaders yourselves, it's important that you voice some of that. What do we need to do? What's the timeline? How are things going to be shifted, given the fact that we have this stabilization of our day-to-day we need to do before we can actually take on and support other things? There will be people, and there will be leaders who make decisions that they're going to carry on anyway. And so all I say is for you, it's going to be a rocky ride, being completely frank and honest. Because if you don't have the baseline to be able to do it, then it's kind of like it'll be the roller coaster ride as you kind of manage through the process. So I'm sorry I don't have a better and nicer answer for that, but the reality is you have to prioritize the bigger change first, or the one that's going to have the most impact on your teams and people first. How do you manage political or divisive comments in your organization that are coming out of the crisis? Yeah, for example, discrimination against Chinese descendants, youth versus elders, et cetera, et cetera. This, and this is kind of what I was talking about around how things will get really nasty before they get better. And there's a lot of folks in the kind of we love to help each other kind of space at the moment, but that there are a lot of people who are experiencing some real challenges. And I think that, if anything, if the last 3 or 4 years have taught us anything just about our world in general, it's around the fact that things are politically divisive. I think it's the environment and the day that we live in, politically divisive at home and externally. When I say at home, I mean in our businesses and externally. And that it's the way of the world at the moment. And it's really unfortunate, but true. And I think that just like with anything, I am a big proponent of calling it. So when I see discrimination, I call it. That could be against women, that could be against ethnicity, that could be against race, it doesn't matter. Now more than ever, diversity and inclusion functions need to be ramping up. These diversity and inclusion are the kinds of things that kind of fall off to the wayside for people, kind of like corporate social responsibility when they're trying to shore up their own businesses. But the reality is that diversity and inclusion and corporate social responsibility are the solutions to being able to get through these kinds of crises. Crises. And so I say, call it out when you see it. I know it's hard to do, but you can't allow that kind of behavior to be out there and open in front of you. And I kind of say, if you're not a part of a solution, you're part of the problem. If you're not prepared to address people on their bad behaviors, particularly where other people are involved, particularly around discrimination, you're part of the problem. So I just encourage people to call out that kind of discrimination, or say, hey, I don't think that's okay, even if you don't get into arguments about it. And I know that sometimes when there are people more senior doing it, it's challenging. But the question is, who are you as a leader, and what are you prepared to accept? What's your threshold? So I think that's about all we have time for. I'm at 12:12. I know a number of you have stayed on, and I thank you for coming. I'm going to stop my share now so you can see me full screen. But I thank you for coming and joining me today, and I hope that it's been helpful. I mentioned that on Thursday at 11 o'clock, I'm doing Effectively Managing Remote Teams. As mentioned, you will get, probably tomorrow, because we're still I needed to figure out what the kind of key things were based upon the questions and what you're interested in. We will send absolutely a one-pager out that you will receive that you can use, which takes you through some of these steps and processes. So thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you coming, and have a great day. Be safe, be healthy, hand wash, social distance, please. But more than anything, make sure you're seeing people. Get on those videos and off of those phones. Have a great one. Bye.